This is ArtMingle, Insight to Impact. I am your host, Mika Heikkilä. Many know me as the artist Mika Oulu. ArtMingle is where culture meets communities and economy. We speak plainly, we follow evidence, we ask how ideas become choices that people keep. Subscribe and join community that turns cultural insights into action. Joining me today are Olga Tykhonova and Sofia Widmann from Museum Booster. Together they work with museums worldwide on innovation, leadership and digital strategy, helping institutions align economic sustainability with staff realities and community value. Welcome Olga and Sofia.
Thank you, Mika, for having us.
Hello, thank you.
Before we get into the frameworks, what's your first ever memory about museums?
Well, I can go first. My very first memory about museum was with my father, and my dad is a psychiatrist. So I do remember very well how he took me on one of my first visits to the museum. I think it was in Kiev, and it was a museum of art history museum. And my dad was explaining to me different artworks, but of course he was explaining them to me from the psychiatric point of view. So he was showing me a portrait of a young man who looked a little bit strange, and he was commenting about what kind of disease he might have. So that had a very big impression, left a very big impression on my life and future career.
So be careful when you talk to Sofia. Maybe in the spirit of childhood, you will get a diagnosis. On my end, maybe counterintuitively, because I'm actually in my professional life wearing two hats. So one is like a researcher and a practitioner working with organisational innovation. On the other hand, as a curator and especially commissioning curator of contemporary art. As a child, I was not taken by my family members to the art museums. It happened to me much longer in a more conscious age. But my beloved grandfather was actually taking me to the Natural History and the History Museum. And I loved those sessions, especially and particularly in the Natural History Museum, because we were taking pencils and paper and I was drawing birds and animals there. And the important thing is that my grandfather is a mathematician, so he has nothing to do with drawing. It was just a mere understanding and appreciation that a child has a passion for drawing, and that drawing was one of my kind of outlets of how I feel and how I perceive the world and kind of process it. And so he was honestly doing it for me. So we were sitting quietly on the floor, the only people at the time in Kiev, who were doing those kind of things, because I'm old enough to kind of still experience the museum in a very traditional and classical way, where you stand politely with your very straight back. So we were quite punkish, a punkish couple, my grandfather and I, just enjoying our time of being together in a welcoming space of a museum that we owned on our own terms. This is my first and very warm kind of memory of a museum in Kiev. And only later I got to know a colleague of mine through in another cultural institution with whom I happened to be born at the same day, which is first interesting overlap. And actually his grandfather or great-grandfather happened to be the scientist who was the one of the founders of that museum. So the world is round and life can have all kinds of unexpected, surprises for you in the pocket.
And because Olga is such a fantastic drawer, that's why when it comes to the visualizations and by having beautiful handwriting for our internal brainstorming, she is always the person who puts it beautifully on paper.
Great. Thank you for sharing those stories. Then let's jump a little bit how museums come from venues to infrastructure. So when does a museum stop then being a venue and start functioning as a cultural infrastructure for a city or region?
Well, if I just make a connection so that it's not fully disrupted from what we said, just for what I shared with you from my personal story now, I think it's a super necessary function of a museum to be that place where you can have a meaningful, creative and safe time with those who are dear to you and who are meaningful to you. And this is an infrastructure that allows you to give value to the world and how you perceive it, and to own it, as I said, like to own it in your own terms, to get access to things that might inspire you, that might boost your thinking, that might challenge your thinking. Unfortunately enough, I think we have less and less of such spaces available to us as contemporary human beings, and depending on the context and given the reality of liberal capitalism, they are getting less and less, right? And they're getting more and more paid for. So there is a pay tag or a paywall attached to places that potentially are so. So I find a little bit of a paradox here, because as humanity, we happen to get to know more and more what is mental well-being, right? What is social well-being? What is the value and the need for social cohesion? And at the same time, right, paradoxically, the spaces for that and the tools available to us as a society are becoming less and less. And I think the museums are really those extremely crucial institutions and why we love them so much, and why we kind of stand for them, and why we think that by no means we need to abandon them, but we really need to enhance them and to kind of join forces in imagining what does it mean to be a relevant museum and what does it mean to be broader, a relevant cultural institution in the now, because they serve us as humans, and they serve us as humans in a society, right? So I think that this is when we need to think of an infrastructure of culture in multiple senses, in very different ways, but always as from through the lens of a human being and that emotional kind of connection that they help us to build.
Is there something that in museums should change internally so that kind of shift happens?
Absolutely. From my perspective, also in museums are very, to most of them, right, are very traditional, and they are used to address, and they're used to be perceived as elitist. Therefore, very often the typical visitor of a museum, right, in our image is a 50-plus-a-year-old woman that goes to an institution and who is loyal to the institution, and also to those people that that have a specific level, certain level of education, that go and feel comfortable in those type of institutions. But now I think that museums have to be more open to different target audiences, and also to attract them on the emotional level, and create the safe spaces and the welcoming spaces to those that might not feel very comfortable entering a museum as a building, as an infrastructure, especially in the times like those, like now.
If I may add a little kind of cameo here, I think it's important to think of the change. Well, first, this metaphor of what is a stereotypical and sometimes stigmatized, right? Loyal visitor, or let's say a stereotypical visitor to the museum, differs slightly in different contexts, right? Because it has a connection to a social and economical framework of a specific country or city, and then it is connected also to the subject matter expertise of a museum, because we clearly need to acknowledge that art museums face a slightly different audience segmentation that, let's say, science museums or science centers, right? This is slightly different. But what is important in cultural organizations and cultural institutions and museums specifically, I think, is also the shift in governance. And this is where we see how more and more the shifts happening in knowledge production and what we consider as a knowledge and consider as a process of acknowledging what is knowledge, producing it and making it available to the people, and finding the language to kind of communicate it and to discuss it and to reflect upon it. How it manifests itself in the curatorial practices, well, quote unquote curatorial practices, has informed and has inspired the shifts in terms how do we make museums inclusive and representative, not only in terms of what audiences do we serve, but also what people work in the institution or think together with institutions, have a say in what is the mission and what's the, let's say, the strategic and the tactical level of institutions. What do they allocate their minds, their resources, right, and their creative power towards. And we literally, I guess, as loyal museum goers or those who spend quite some time willingly in those institutions, can feel as people, right, those shifts. So more and more there are those like citizen juries, or I don't know, young adults advisory boards in organizations. It's such an inspiration. I don't know. It's like literally a breath of fresh air in institutions that were before thought as like very polite, right? And serving the high-end canon and the ultimate etalon of what knowledge is. I think there is a lot of liberation and a lot of creativity happening in this governance model, right? And what it allows to happen in, with, and within the institutions, and how people actually start to get a feeling belonging to the institutions and kind of sharing this accountability with and for the institutions. I think that's super important.
I'm also interested how different kind of culture organizations can create economic value, and doing research on that. So from your research, where do museums actually create measurable economic value, and where do these claims tend to fall apart?
Well, if you look at the economical system of museums, it differs from continent to the continent, right? And from culture to culture. And we see that traditionally in Europe, most of the public institutions are being funded either by the cities or by governments, or depending on the structure. And especially art institutions are more heavily relying on the funding of those governments and cities. And mostly it's the proportion of sometimes 80% or 70% are being paid by of the support by the government. And the rest are generated mostly through ticket sales and then auxiliary services and sponsorships. While in the science centers, the situation is different, and they have to, and historically have a need to generate more revenue by themselves. And now we see globally, and also especially in Europe, that governments are they need to invest money somewhere else. With the war ongoing in Europe, a lot of money goes to the defense, and they're being repurposed. So museums, especially now, need to search for new revenue sources and how they can provide additional value to communities that are in the city or in the country, and for which institutions would be willing to pay for. And this is where the new economic models are starting to being created. And this is where museums need to work together and to co-create, and especially to exchange data, benchmark data that they have, to help each other to perform better and to become more, to generate more revenue.
What kind of indicators then there are, and what kind of indicators would be most reliable in practice?
Well, as an economist by training, I'm always speaking more about how much money can museums generate through, in this perspective, by auxiliary services and by enabling different kinds of sponsorships and partnerships with other organizations and companies. So if we're speaking, for example, very basically about the services that museums provide, many museums generate revenue through their shops, right? And when we speak about shops, there is not much benchmarking, which is happening in the museum sector. So if we speak and if we compare museums in one city, they are not sharing the data of how they are performing, which are the best-selling products, and what is the average revenue per square meter. So this is where we speak about a very practical example of museum shops. And by comparing that and improving those operations, museum can reach additional revenue within this specific department.
What kind of capability gaps most often prevent then museums from acting as a real economic infrastructure?
I believe that has to do a lot with training capabilities and with leadership trainings. What we see that many people that come and work in the museum field, if we're not speaking about the financial departments, they do not have financial and economical background. For science centers, art history museums, most of them, there are people that have art history or science backgrounds. And when it comes to the training within economical thinking, but also leadership training and upskilling in the field of digital transformation, there is not much training available. And when it's available, I don't think that it's very much in the culture of museums and other institutions as a regular thing to send their teams and employees to those types of trainings. Therefore, sometimes there is a bottleneck, or there are bottlenecks inside of the institutions.
I don't necessarily think that it's a matter only of culture. I agree with that. I'm not negating it. But I also think that there is a lack of prioritization of that aspect because especially because we operate a lot on the European level in terms of thinking along the lines of European projects and how they're being done. There is a lot of knowledge generating of what needs to be changed, right? And there is a lot of funding coming from the European Union and all kinds of strands of knowledge production to kind of make available courses, online things for institutions to kind of tap into in specific areas of knowledge. But oftentimes they're very fragmented. They are not kind of systematic on the level of provision them, right? They are not systematic in terms of scanning the horizon and understanding that you cannot do it once a snapshot in time. So where do we stand in terms of, just for a sake of example, like digitalization, for example, right? Or, AI ethics in one time. It needs to be consistent, right? For us to understand how is it shifting? What are the parameters? What are the factors that are informing it? How are we actually moving along the axis of like efficiency and improvement and evolvement? But the second, even more chronicle problem is that our sector is heavily overworked and overstressed. And there is a lack of being able to prioritize that learning and to acknowledge as an institution that in order to acquire new skills, you need to carve out essential time to be able to get it and to process it. And then to process it not on the level of only an individual employee, but also how does it then manifest itself in an organization as a team, as a social structure, right? And in terms of how does knowledge travel within a specific institution and its human stack. So we oftentimes talk about if we stay with the metaphor of the digitalization, that it's right, talking about the technical stack or tech stack available to the institutions, but there is less discussion of what does it mean and how it is connected to the human stack and upskilling and understanding and building not only the digital literacy, but the digital courage of institution, which has this very important aspect. How do you treat your staff as people and as a social kind of dynamics within that organization? And again, I know I'm kind of putting it for the second time, but we need to look into institutions as the human aspect of it. It's not just an abstraction. It's not a mechanism or a machine. The metaphor of machinery and machine-alike efficiency has brought us as a humanity, especially from the lens of modernism, not to very good results, right? And not to very good kind of conclusions. We need to be more organic and ecological in this respect. So when we talk about this, boosting and enhancing our capabilities and intelligence as organizations, it's extremely important to talk about if we acknowledge that we need to get new intelligence, new contextual intelligence, there needs to be time allocated for that. You cannot just constantly stack it as lifelong learning. Again, the massive corrosion that we got from neoliberal capitalism, right? It's your own responsibility to learn at your own time alongside a huge scope of work. And then secondly, how do we abolish hierarchical structures that are oftentimes siloed? And how do we acknowledge and let this knowledge breathe in our institutions and create more transversal working patterns?
What is the smallest capacity upgrade that makes the biggest difference, or what could make the biggest difference?
Sofia, what would be your choice? Because I have mine at the top of my head right now. I think it's internal communications.
I think it's a lot about co-creation and coming to more agile structures of working. as we see in many institutions, departments are mostly working within departments and not really when it comes to generating, developing new ideas that are where different skills and departments are interconnected. So I guess talking to start talking and communicating more directly with your fellow colleagues is probably one of the smallest steps one can take in the development of bold projects.
Then let's transfer to the human cost of transformation. So how does digital transformation then actually affect in the museum working conditions on the ground?
I think it stresses them. That would be my organic reaction. It's stressful because cultural organizations oftentimes are playing a catch-up game. There's the socio-technic corpus is moving much faster than museums can catch up, and it puts a lot of pressure. The structures that are built, the technology develops in a way that has a lot of that needs a lot of critical reflection, and oftentimes it exists as a walled garden that benefits the purposes, the ethical purposes that are not aligning with the ones that we as cultural organizations are standing for, right? So we're kind of fighting on several fields at the same time. On one hand, we do not have the economical muscle and the kind of capabilities muscle to provide an alternative on time to keep up with that pace. And on another hand, we have and we are responsible for the ethical standard, right? So, because that is our role in the society. How do we critically reflect? How do we make sense of what is happening around us? And we need time for that critical reflection. And technology, especially, or technology complexes and industries that are serving like money-making machines, oftentimes follow a proprietary logic, which is in conflict, right, with how museums are working or how cultural organizations are working on what goals they are trying to achieve and what is their social function. So hence it puts a lot of pressure on cultural organizations. And then from more romantic and more philosophical aspect, I'll step into the ground of us humans. We also need to acknowledge that our financial muscle is dramatically lower than other industries. And this means even that to be able to hire the workforce that is at the avant-garde and at the forefront and experimenting boldly and catching up and like is up to date with all the multiple updates that are happening at the same time, right? We are struggling to provide a competitive pay to be able to hire those people and to motivate them to see us as decent employees in this respect. So we normally kind of are interesting in terms of that this is creative work. This is an impactful work. This is the one where you are becoming a responsible citizen, right? And you're doing a lot of work that helps you to pay back to the society and to make to kind of think boldly in terms of how do we make the world a better place to live with each other. But on another hand, it boils down to a payroll, right? And how much are we able to pay as cultural organizations? It's not a secret that this is a challenge. This is a structural challenge.
To add a little bit on that, I love museums. So I'm here I'm in here not for the money, but for the purpose in my life and for how many fantastic people are working in the field with whom we can co-create and learn. But indeed, when it comes to technological transformation, when there is, let's say, a financial muscle and there is a grant that an institution receives for a new software or for a position that can be filled in, very often afterwards, such projects die within a certain time frame once money or the support is no longer there. In bigger cases, and Olga, as one of the masterminds behind the project Doors, digital incubator for small and medium-sized museums, was working specifically on this. On this topic by training and evaluating and helping small and medium-sized institutions build the capacity and understand how to develop and maintain various digital tools to make sure that once the funding is no longer there, the project can be on and up and running.
It connects to what you were asking before, Mika, right? We cannot not think that cultural organizations are also infrastructures. And when we talk about how technology manifests itself in institutions, we cannot follow just a project-based logic, which oftentimes we are trapped into because of the funding and because of the priorities. But in order to sustain an infrastructure and to keep it gradually evolving and evolving in a sense-making way, it implies a prioritization, a certain level of prioritization and acknowledgement within an organization. And then it means that it needs to be resourced properly, both in terms of money and then how money manifests itself in terms of the skills and capabilities that you have to maintain and develop those infrastructures.
Are there any signals that tell you that the institution is close to burnout?
Well, take it into consideration how many hours we are all working in the cultural sector and to juggle between the different tasks and the ongoing pressure from what governments, but also other stakeholders expect from the institutions to deliver. This pressure is there. And well, just coming back from FACT conference in ACME in Australia, where the discussions were very active and very vocal about how we are all overworked, how there is big mental stress load due to the fact that we don't know what will be the situation in the future. Currently, it looks not that optimistic. Budgets are being cut everywhere. Institutions have to figure out by themselves how they can survive and how they can have the same or generate the same outputs as they did before, but with less staff and less money. So there is this anxiety, which is felt everywhere. So I can't tell you the exact statistic from the World Health Organization of how the museum sector is affected by that. But I guess probably it's depressive.
I wouldn't say it's depressive, but there are certain factors. It's alarming. Let's stay on a positive realist note. It's alarming. And I think one of the factors, or one of the parameters that shows it is the migration of workforce. And that eventually there is a way too high and alarming kind of level of when workforce at a certain age and a certain level, this like level of career development, leave the sector because they cannot hold it anymore, or because their priorities start to shift from just values driven towards also facing the economical reality. And this migration is showing us that, right, we are probably there is an issue there. So we need to kind of take it into account. This is a massive thing. On the other hand, there is a slow happening change that institutions also acknowledge, that how do we take care of the well-being of our staff, right? How do we reconsider the workflows? How are we not only manifesting the slogan of less is more, but start doing it, walk the talk and start practicing it. It's a shift that is taking pace. The pace is slower than we would need, but it is happening. So there is this we need to kind of work out the balance, right? Acknowledging that there is an issue there and like how fast can we move with it? But clearly the change is happening. So I wouldn't say that we are not moving into the direction that helps to improve the situation, but there are many issues in this respect that we need to be aware of and keep an eye on, and that we need to articulate also to our stakeholders as a cultural sector in principle and openly discuss. I think the honesty and emotional support to each other is one of the aspects where we really need to align as cultural institutions, that there are things that we need to prioritize and where we need certain levels of solidarity to kind of lobby for those changes to be resourced, for us to prioritize them, to find the time and space and resources to come improve them. This is super important.
So the leadership is under pressure. What leadership challenges repeat themselves when museums try to change fast?
Can I start with the obvious? Because we need, sorry for stating the obvious, there is a difference between a leader, singular, and leadership, right? As a cultural shift, and leadership as being plural and porous by definition. But we still need to acknowledge that it's a lonely place at the top. it's a lot of pressure for people who are running the organizations, and especially for the people who are leading the organization. So this is the first thing that we need to acknowledge. There is a shift in terms of how do we understand let's put it straightforward, what a museum director is and what is the profile of that person. It shifted a lot. If we look into the early 2000s, right, and if we think of an art museum, for example, the expectation was that the art museum director would be more of an art historian or a star curator or something like that. That was the shift where we were moving with the new institutionalism and those things. Now the challenges are becoming so pressing and burning that more and more, as Sofia was saying before, you're expected to be a brilliant manager, a very good person, like eloquent and skilled and charismatic in pitching both to the municipality, to the national governmental board that wants you to be very transparent about the numbers, to your sponsors and donors who like champagne moments and ribbon cutting moments, and then to your community of the artists, for example, who are versed along very different lines. So just even if you imagine this task list, it's a profile for already several people or several kind of backgrounds that the person needs to navigate under a single head, right? So the pressure is just burning, and the understanding of what is expected of a leader and how many fronts this person needs to fight at the same time leads us to the need of this shift, why leadership becomes plural, right? As well, because it's not possible for one person to be doing it without reaching, because your previous question, a burnout at a certain level. We are all humans. We need to acknowledge the limit of human capacities. At a certain moment in time, it will hit us. There is a price to pay for that level of responsibility.
And at the same time, if we look at how museum sector is organized and how many museum directors are being elected for 5 years, and they are expected to reach specific numbers, and everyone is being afraid of making a mistake and not being re-elected for the next term. So there is an immense pressure on the cultural leaders and not really an acceptance of failures that are part of leadership and that have to be embedded also and acknowledged and accepted from the governmental bodies.
Thank you for listening. I make ArtMingle for people like you who build culture. Get the inside article and the short brief at mikaoulu.com/artmingle. Follow me on LinkedIn, join the newsletter, bring a colleague with you next time. What kind of leadership behavior makes then the transformation safer for the staff?
In this case, maybe an example of an institution. We had just recently an interview with Vilvita Science Center in Bergen in Norway. And what's really fantastic about them is that they have a completely flat structure, horizontal structure, and agile management and work within the teams. So probably the modern picture of leadership, it is when it's distributed and when people are happy to take upon their responsibility and act within their field of action and implement certain changes that every team, all museum members are aligned with.
I also think that trust plays a very big role, and what we understand as trust capital in the organization. I think as a society, we made many necessary evolutionary and qualitative shifts in terms of what do we understand as responsibility and accountability. So this more human approach to so that as a leader, you're not standing out for that top of the hierarchy, but it's about acknowledgement. It's about trusting your team and delegating responsibilities and decision making. It's a shared risk taking. If you think of a director, you cannot be both at the same time a brilliant art historian, a brilliant business manager, a brilliant politician or diplomat, and a brilliant, I don't know, for example, an expert in digital, knowing all the hurdles and all the traps, that come with that, from production to kind of inhabiting the social dimension of the digital reality. And a communication expert at the same time. This means that you need to distribute, to acknowledge what is your human stack? Who is with you in that boat? And how do you take it not as a boat, but as a garden, and you take care of it and you grow organically with your team, and you allow other people to also kind of grow and bloom. So this is not about proprietary logic that my institution is brilliant because I am brilliant and I'm taking I'm reaping all the fruits and put all the jewels in my own crown. But this is like a distributed leadership, right? Acknowledging and giving voice and giving limelight to the rest of your team as well. And voicing out also honestly where the institution struggles. I think it is, and in many kind of practices that we find important and that we are trying to vocalize and to make more visible across the peers. And we work a lot with the professional workforce, right, in the community. So maybe as Museum Booster, we do less for the audiences, but we do focus and work with the workforce, right, with the people who work in the sector. This is our community. This is our tribe.
I can jump on it in the meantime of speaking about being lonely at the top and museum leadership. One of the events that we are doing as part of Museum Booster is called Museum Leadership House. The Museum Leadership House, it is a non-profit platform that we built as part of Museum Booster, where we invite every year 30 bold museum leaders and directors to a house, physical house. Every time this house takes a different shape. And the idea is that every leader checks, so the condition, they check in their ego at the entrance, and we're discussing the challenges that museum leadership is facing now, and what are the future needs that will be there in the museum sector, and what are the skill, mindsets, and knowledge we need to have to be able to address those challenges. And our last Museum Leadership House took place in Dubai as part of the ICOM Triennial. We have a cooperation with ICOM Intercom. And during those discussions, we specifically were talking about that there is no proper leadership training in the museum sector. While in the banking sector, in the real estate, automotive, telecommunication, all of the leaders are used to have regular trainings about how to navigate change, how to navigate complexity, how to what are the different leadership styles, and how to motivate the different team members. And in the museum sector, it is not the case. Museum leaders are not trained in this way and not regularly. So to address this challenge, we are starting Museum Booster Academy. It is a training program for museum leaders, both on the top level leadership, but also second level leadership, where we'll be in a 2-day intensive program. Museum leaders will be trained in a co-creation and environment on how they can tackle their daily challenges and what are the modern tools, methods available for that to implement the change and make sure that the transformation happens in the museum sector.
Then let's move on inclusion and minority communities and place and value and inclusion, how it can be as a structure, not outreach. So when and how does inclusion move from good intention to real institutional practice?
For us, we worded in one of our workshops that we're doing currently in a project with a cultural organization is how do we move from just manifesting values to building evidence, right? And kind of having impactful practices on one hand, but then operationalizing them in a strategic level. I think one of the good examples here, and maybe I would just instead of speaking of in general and abstract level, provide an example from an institution, a real life kind of case, is the Birmingham Museums, which is quote unquote a brand, let's put it like this, an institutional brand that is a family of 9 institutions of different profiles in a city as diverse and with quite a history as Birmingham. So I think we kind of all understand what the more or less the context behind it, historically, socially, demographically, right, and economically. And understanding that when you are inhabiting a city with such a diverse background, with many of the let's say with many tribes across the city in multiple levels, how do you become a meaningful institution? How can you make sure that you are sensitive to this context? Whom do you need to include in this conversation? How do you make sure that you are doing it right? How do you design even those pit stops and check-in moments where you assess yourself, where you have an honest critical discussion, and with whom? And how does it transform then into the action? The Birmingham Museums have thought of it very carefully to begin with, and to come back to the previous point I was making, they have a co-directorship. So it's not that the one director or a single person bears the burden of, being at the top of the feed chain, of being at the leader, being a leader of the organization. It's already 2 people who, of course, kind of in dialogue and in this dynamic start to build out, like, so how do we do the decision making, and how do we do the design, and can have this honest conversation, at least not single-handedly, right? But kind of bring their own backgrounds. And it's important also who are the people behind this leadership. But then they thought it's also like having 2 people is of course better than 1, but it also doesn't solve the problem that much. So what the Birmingham Museums have done, they have established the citizen jury, the first operating and fully running citizen jury that sent very openly the invitation in a good old manner per post, to the citizens of of Birmingham, and then made made a demographically representative body, the citizen jury, designed the whole process as you would see it, like in a metaphor of a law system, right, or how it happens in the court, to co-design with those people. So what does it mean to be a museum in Birmingham? Like, what's a relevant institution, and what kind of services is it providing? What kind of space is it providing? And what does it mean to be a museum specific, not in general in the world, but what does it mean to be a museum in Birmingham? What kind of communities are you serving? And how to make sure that we also align, and we do not timestamp that we're doing it just now and we agree upon it. How do we stay relevant as the time progresses, as the institution changes? And of course, those conversations and those thoughts are bringing a lot of unexpected encounters. So honestly, when they started it, you need to step onto this ground with a very open mind, because if you are honestly embracing change, you have no control, and you have you cannot imagine fully like how it will manifest itself, right? It means that, again, you need to be embracing shared risk-taking. As much as you are embracing the imagination of many people, their commitment and their generous gift of time, right? This is what we're talking about, involvement, commitment, but also their thoughts. You need to be ready to also, as we said, check in your ego at the door, and to be listening and to be hearing what those people are saying, and to be prepared to change. And then how does it manifest itself in an institution that clearly also have very, very different people on board? You really need to then reconsider how is your decision making is being designed when you open up this conversation, and you are opening the floor to your fellow citizens, because in this dialogue you are becoming a fellow citizen, right? Because you all live in the city of Birmingham. You all belong equally to the city. So I think this is a very good example in terms of how can it take a different shape, and how much boldness and courage and how much gratitude it takes actually to kind of design, open up that space, and then to hold that conversation.
It's sharing power, not just representation. Then how can museums build trust with minority or underrepresented communities without extraction or tokenism? And I add another question in the same one. So what mistakes then also the institutions repeat despite the good intentions?
Well, there is no universal answer to that, because the sensitivities are so context specific. right? When we talk about, for example, just the diversity issue or the inclusivity issue in Finland, or the diversity and inclusivity issue in Birmingham, just like to follow the train of thought with the previous example, we will be talking about different contexts, right? And it would take a very different shape as a conversation if you would want to step into it. Also because of the disbalances of what, let's say, colonialism, how it took shape in those specific contexts, or how the being marginalized, what does it mean to be marginalized in those contexts, and how historically solidified it has been. Then the unlearning practice has a different depth depending on the context and has a different texture. So I would say that maybe it's not a mistake, but the challenge that, because I cannot universalize what the mistake is, it depends. We really need to look at like case by case, or at least context by context. But I think the challenge is always to acknowledge how much time it takes to build trust. And you need to be really honest to build the trust on both sides or on multiple sides, because it's not a binary discussion, right? It's like on multiple sides. And if you really want change, to allocate enough of resources for that. And resources here should be taken from different perspectives. And if it's not only about money, time is a huge resource, right? Openness and being willing to change also kind of takes a lot of energy and mental space. And then carving out and reconsidering what is an institution and how do you approach programming is also a very important part of it. Maybe just to tap into what Sofia mentioned in her previous reply, and how does it translate into, for example, a directorship and a leadership tenure being connected to a certain only limited stretch of time? This poses another question to the museum directors, so people in leadership positions. How do they even design a practice in a way that even if they are not taking the seat in the institution for the upcoming 5 years, there is a critical amount of change and shift and knowledge and ethical behavior within the institution that you cannot reverse engineer this change? Right? If we talk about it in more specific examples, for example, in the North America, there has been, over the course of the last decade, I think a very interesting and meaningful practice that museum directors built in their contracts. The practice of identifying whom they would see as their, or having a say, who will be their follower. Carving out, for example, enough space for more representation of female directors or people with from LGBTQ community or people from marginalized community of a different ethnicity, so kind of breaking the glass walls and the glass ceilings within the hierarchy of who is a tradition, who is the metaphor or the stereotype of a leader in that specific context. So you use your deontic capital as a current leader or as a leader wanted by an institution and the pool of stakeholders to step in the now, to make sure and to design, what is leadership, not only within your 5 years, but also in the longer term perspective. I find it extremely, extremely important to think of the sustainability of change and not to kind of capsule it only in the 5 years. And it's an extreme challenge. It is a challenge, honestly.
Here, I completely agree with Olga, what she mentioned in this aspect. What I would probably also would like to add is that many mistakes that are being made, very often museums are not really willing to talk about them, right? Everyone loves talking about successes and what great things we did, and not really very much about mistakes. And this is a part which is missing, or there has to be more work being more openly communicating about all of the things that go wrong. And for that, an honest and open exchange is required on the leadership level. And we have been seeing it a lot through our Future Museum project, which is an ongoing international research project where we bring together different museum directors and senior leaders from now 90 different countries. And this is where we talk openly about the mistakes that are being done and what are the learnings from those mistakes, and how can those mistakes bring us to something more beautiful.
If you could change one funding or policy rule tomorrow, what would most improve museums' resilience?
It's a very good one.
Very good one.
Sometimes it might be a provocative answer, but I believe if museums could act sometimes as for-profit institutions, it might help them in the long run if we speak about specific operations. Then they would become more flexible and more agile. But I see Olga now pinning, visually giving me hints.
Stabbing.
Stabbing, totally.
It's hard for me to answer this question because I don't believe in single solutions that work universally. And I think this is one of the things that I'm preaching and practicing is we need to be context sensitive. You need to kind of really acknowledge what constitutes your reality. How does it relate to your social responsibilities, to understanding and comprehending who your audiences are, who your community is, and what goals are you serving? What is your mission, honestly, meaning beyond just wordsmithing and the intention of well-meaning. And only then you can identify what is the change that would help you. But still, I'm thinking about your question. So what is the change that would...
That would be understanding the community, I take from that. That's a good answer, I think, already for that one. Then going on more of this playing, what should policymakers stop asking museums to prove?
How many visitors came to their institution on an annual basis?
Yeah, I would even reframe it. So what do politicians take as a metrics of an efficiently running institution? Because counting heads or legs or whatever you're counting as a body part or whatever you identify as a human being does not add an understanding what is the meaningful impact or what is the cohesion that the institution is sustainably and resiliently providing for that community.
One change for policymakers now to strengthen the cultural economy.
Yeah, and understanding that I agree with that one, and understanding that the cultural economy taps not only into the, let's say, visitor economy or entertainment or education economy, but also understanding that it has a leg in healthcare, in social well-being, or what's the word I'm looking for? Social security. And also the future-proofing of society in terms of the future skills. It goes so much beyond just culture as taking a role and taking a responsibility for safeguarding cultural heritage and cultural assets. The acknowledgement of the social role of culture and cultural institutions is extremely important. So it's kind of networking and transversally connecting culture to so many more spheres. Would also inform how do you assess it, right? Because not in all of that, counting again the human beings that are just hitting the door would be the meaning making or sense making metrics. And then understanding what is exactly the value, and even in monetary sense, what is the value that institutions are bringing, then would expand the understanding how much revenue do institutions get through ticket sales, because it also lies elsewhere. And what about all those visits that are not pertaining a ticket or that operate in a different impact and in a different rhythm of changing or impacting our societies and providing other kinds of services?
And here, I guess it all boils down to the purpose. What is the purpose of museums, and how the measurements that are done by the governments can be tied to that?
Yeah, it's overall a question of reinterpretation of the metaphor, what a museum is standing for. How do we understand what it is as a cultural institution, so that we do not operate in the logic of the definition that we inherited from the 19th or 20th century. And I think that what keeps, to say the least of it, all the cultural sector busy, and sometimes even at or icon busy. That's quite a process to observe. How do we carve out the new definition what a museum is?
Let's flip the perspective, and then if you both give me one message to communities, how they can use culture for development.
I think it's not only about visitors and audiences, but understanding that there is a community around the museum, right? And there are people are not only visiting museums, but there are also people working within museums, and we are all equally people. And even decision makers and policy makers are also people that come to museums. They're not only deciding on the destiny of those institutions they're funding, but they also have a weekend and spend then time with their families or significant others in those institutions, and they benefit as citizens from the role that and from the impacts that those institutions are bringing to us, collective us. I would quote here, or I would highlight here, one of our colleagues and partners in our practice, and major inspirations, Rob Hopkins, and his kind of motto: we need to move from what is to the big what if. And this is where I think we need to acknowledge and see institutions and museums particularly as imagination activists. We need to allow ourselves the agency and take accountability that we have a say in terms of imagining what does it mean to be together in a different, more ecological and more healthy way and kinder way. And what does it mean to work together also in a different way? And museums provide that critical space. I don't mean only square meters, of course, but them as well, to be able to imagine with the others how that can look like.
And then from both of you, if you could mention one book or article or cultural experience that inspired you lately.
It's a tough choice.
Well, if speaking about a book that inspired me to see culture differently from the well-being perspective and to the perspective how it affects us as human beings from the neuroscientific perspective, for me, it's the book called Your Brain on Art. So it's about how the arts transforms us from the neuroscientific perspective. And it was written by Susan McZaman and Evie Ross. For me, it was a very interesting read in the perspective of how culture in general can help us live better lives as human beings and impact our quality of life.
Can I suggest too, to stay on one track with Sofia and to expand your thought? To complement your thought, I would suggest Ed Young's book, An Immense World, which is a brilliant exploration and observation that we are not the only ones inhabiting the world. There is a huge biodiversity, and we actually know so little and comprehend so little, and consequently then take into account so little how we understand how other species and how other beings in the world are perceiving this world. And as humans, we are affecting it so dramatically. We are kind of shaping the environment for the other species without understanding what it means for them to co-live with us and to co-inhabit. So I think it complicates the matter of understanding that not only humans are different and we're not doing a great job even there, but there is such a broader world, right? And so I think it's a mind-expanding book. But since I mentioned Rob, I would want to do a service to Rob as well, because he just recently had a new book coming out, and I trust him so much in terms of it's like a treasure box of cases and real. I like his footnotes even more than the text, because if you read the book overnight like I did, then I spend the whole month just following on the cases that he's providing there, and it just living on Google and the web pages of those projects, people, talks and everything. It's called How to Fall in Love with the Future, a Time Traveler's Guide to Changing the World by Rob Hopkins. Heavily recommended. Rob, we love you so much. The whole Museum Booster loves you so much.
Thank you. That is very inspiring. And it has been so inspiring to talk with you both. And I believe many people will benefit hearing this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mika.
Thank you, Mika.
I am delighted that you were here with me. Thank you for giving your time and attention. New episodes bring practical ideas you can use, clear takeaways, shareable materials. Follow the show, join the newsletter, and tell about ArtMingle to one friend who cares about culture and communities. I am Mika Heikkilä, also known as the artist Mika Oulu. ArtMingle, Insight to Impact. See you next time.